This is an audio course. Thank you for listening.
Well, I'm excited to chat with you about focus and attention. That comes up a lot from listeners. And at first I was hoping you could settle this for me once and for all. These goldfish attention spans, human attention span shrinking, being worse than that of a goldfish. Is this a myth? How is this measured? How do we even know if the status of the American attention span this day and age?
Great question. And the answer is no, we do not have the attention span of a goldfish. We are stable in our attention. It has not shrunk.
Oh, okay.
In fact, there's nothing really wrong with our attention, and that's the sort of paradox of this moment is that oftentimes we feel like our attention is in crisis, but frankly, our attention systems are working perfectly. And to answer your question about how we know is because we as cognitive neuroscientists who study attention have been using this same type of basic attention task for decades, about 4 or 5 decades now. And we haven't seen a blip or a change since the advent of the internet and the advent of smartphones and their prevalence. Nothing's really changed. We're still pretty much the same brain we've been for quite some time.
And what is the attention task that you use?
There's a whole bunch of them, but one example would be where we, for example, would have people come into the lab and their task is to sit in front of a computer screen and they see a series of digits on the screen, kind of appearing let's say one every second or so, and press the button every time you see a digit, except if that digit is 3. And when you see a 3, withhold your response. But the 3s only appear about 5% of the time. So that's one example. And what happens is people are terrible at this task, and they've always been terrible at this task because, it seems pretty simple to just look at a digit on the screen and press a button. But we are very much prone to what's called mind wandering or internal distractibility. And that rate of internal distractibility is pretty stable. It's a high number, about 50% of our waking moments. We can get hijacked away from the task at hand. But that number has not gone up since, like I said, cell phones, internet, etc. And then there's other ways we can do it too, looking at things called working memory, where we're just looking at sort of the cache or RAM, if you will, of your mind, your internal capacity to have a scratch space. That also has not changed over time.
Well, I am just enough of a dork. So if you'll indulge me, I'd love to know all of these because I went down this rabbit hole of research associated with the Stroop word color test. And I even found a game on the iPhone called Stroop, which lets you play red, green, red, because for listeners not in the know, it might show the word red written in a green font color, and you have to select the font color from options, which may also be mixed. So it's tricky for your brain to attend to the thing and subdue or ignore the other thing you might naturally do. And so that's just kind of fun. I don't know if I'm actually doing something good for my brain by playing this repeatedly and trying to beat my score. Well, you tell me. Is that a helpful activity?
I love that you're interested in the Stroop task. And yes, just to refresh people in terms of what this task is, because it's a classic task of attention. And what we're doing is unnaturally making your brain go to war with itself. So the task itself is, yes, you'll see a series of words on a screen, and your job is to press a button indicating the color of the font and do that as fast as possible. Most of the time, when the font color is presented and it's some all X's or all O's, we have no problem with this. We just press the button to indicate the color. But when we make it go to war with itself, we're actually causing your brain to have to inhibit a very, very natural and automatic process, which is reading. So now we're going to present those words, like you said, in the letters of a color word. So the word yellow would be in orange font or something like that, right? So there's a conflict there. Your job is to detect the font color, but the word yellow is so prominent that you want to say yellow, and that you'd be wrong. So it absolutely is engaging a very specific kind of attention process, executive control. But if you keep doing it over and over again, probably you'll get better at the task and not much else. Not much else.
I was hoping it would correlate to something.
Yeah. And that's the thing about the brain. It's a smart organ and it will get very specific in its ability to maximize learning, but it's also very context specific. So now if I give you some other task where I put your brain at war with itself, you may not benefit because you're well practiced at color word inhibition, but you may not be practiced at some other form of inhibition. And actually, it's so funny that you mentioned that because it's very much related to the kind of things that we were doing in my lab. Brain training games are so prominent and they're available all over. Like you said, you downloaded an app to do this, but it ends up that there's not a lot of generalizability. There's not a lot of evidence that after doing this game 100 times, or let's even say through every day over the course of a year, you might see that your score on the game is getting better and better and better. But now if I transfer to some other task, it's going to be back to where it was as if you'd never seen this kind of task before.
It's almost a trope nowadays, like, oh, with digital distractions, our minds are being hijacked. And so you're saying, well, no, according to the measures that we've had for decades, it looks like our attention spans are actually doing okay. Is something different? Has something changed? It feels like it has in our experience.
Well, both of the things that you said are true. Our attention is more prone to being hijacked and our attention spans are unchanged. So why is our attention more prone to being hijacked? Because the opportunities for distraction are greater in our day-to-day lives. So the way in which we are prone to distraction is because social media companies, technology developers are gaming the way the brain is organized. There's a reason why when you go on a particular website, let's say a social media website, your name is prominent. The content is pretty much tied to what is of interest to you. It's catered to you. There's also a reason why things that are fear-inducing, threatening, novel, interesting grab your attention. In fact, your attention is the commodity, is the product that the social media company is selling to make money for its own company. So yes, it absolutely is the case that you are going to be sucked in because not your own failings, but because a team of engineers, not just an engineer or two, but like literally hundreds of people have built very sophisticated algorithms that not only know how your attention works, but know precisely how to tune the enticements to your attention so that you will spend as much time as possible on the app. And so if you notice the qualities of that information, self-related, threatening, fear-inducing, novel, this is what the brain is tuned for through our evolutionary programming, through our evolutionary development. Of course, it's the case that you'll drop everything and pay attention to something novel, interesting, or threatening, or related to you, because that advantaged your survival over the millennia that humans have existed. So that's what's being sort of gamed and capitalized upon. And that's why the way we're going to have to battle the hijacking of our attention is going to require something different. We can't simply just break up with our phones. We're going to have to do something in a different manner to be able to manage the kind of pull we're going to get on our attention. Very different from saying that there's something wrong with our attention. There is not.
I hear you. So in a lab-controlled setting where the smartphone's away, it's like, hey, our mental capabilities are pretty similar to how they've been. But in the real life, we've got distraction machines surrounding us like never before. Is that how we've got both things true at the same time?
Yes. Both things are true at the same time, but I do think it's a point of empowering ourselves to know there's nothing fundamentally broken here.
Yeah. Amen.
In fact, it's the fact that it's so healthy and so predictable that allows these algorithms to be built around maximizing that. And so part of the responsibility, I frankly think, is on a lot of app developers and social media companies and technology companies to be aware of the costs on that and to build in features that might help us monitor better our own engagement with the technology. It doesn't advantage their bottom line, but advantages our ability to function healthfully. I think the other part of the answer is really what I wanted to share in my book, which is that we can train our own mind, not through brain training games, but through other methodologies that might help us advantage ourselves better because we are training ourselves to be more aware moment by moment of where our attention is. to make better choices that favor what we want to accomplish and what we want to do.
Well, I was just about to ask that next. So this book, Peak Mind, Find Your Focus, Own Your Attention, Invest 12 minutes a day. Tell us, what's the big idea here and what's the magic of 12 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, the big idea is essentially what we started talking about, that we live in a world now where it feels like a crisis of attention, even if the objective data tells us our brains are actually fine and healthy. And that crisis of attention feeling, by the way, if we locked ourselves in a room, had no technology, and we're really intending to focus, we would discover that our attention is not going to be unwavering. And it's not a modern feature. If we look back hundreds of years to medieval monks, that they actually did that. They became monastics. They isolated themselves from their families. And then they complained that while they were supposed to be praying, they were worried about lunch or a conversation they had. So this is also something really to appreciate about the nature of the mind. It is built for distractibility. So even though our capacity for attention has not changed, we are distractible. It's just the way it is. And there's again, an evolutionary reason for that. But it ends up that under certain circumstances, very high stress, high demand circumstances, like the kinds of professional lives of a lot of the people that we study in my laboratory, that number, that percentage of time that we're intrinsically distractible goes up. And then we can really suffer a lot of problems, so that our attention is not in the task at hand. We lapse, we make errors, and those can be consequential, life or death in the case of service members or emergency services professionals, medical professionals, surgeons, for example, or even judges and lawyers. If you miss information, it has consequences.
So that with a stress perspective, I guess I was thinking in some ways, stress can really galvanize your attention. Like, okay, it's do or die. This is the moment. Got to get her done. The clock is ticking. And so in some ways, I thought that would make us less distractible. You say it can make us more distractible. Can you elaborate?
So it ends up stress is a variable that can range from actually being very helpful to harmful. And we can even think of it as having a shape. So if you think of it, imagine in your mind a graph, and I'm drawing on the graph, the X and the Y axis, and then the shape of the graph itself is an inverted U. So on the X axis, we have stress, low performance. So the Y axis is performance. The X axis is stress, low performance. As the stress goes up, you start climbing up the U, kind of like the top of a mountain, and your performance will reach a sweet spot so that the right amount of stress is going to optimize your performance. But now, if you push past that sweet spot and stress keeps going up, you're on the downward slope where you're actually going to start degrading and depleting your performance relative to having less stress available to you. So we can parse the way we think about stress as eustress, meaning the letters E and U, meaning beneficial stress, or distress. And what ends up happening with a lot of the groups that we work with, like I said, service members, first responders, even students for that matter, what might be the optimal amount of stress, that eustress peak point, if you maintain that level of demand over a long period of time, you will start slipping into distress. And most of us will not be aware that that is happening. So it's like to think about a student. Oh, I'm really good if I have to cram for a final 3 nights before I have to take the final. Now, if you got 7 finals, I guarantee you that cramming approach night after night after night is not going to lead to beneficial results. So it's just important to know that the features of stress that I'm talking about that are problematic are really dipping into distress. There's not a match between what you feel like you can accomplish well and your capacity to do so.
Oh, really? So we don't even know.
Yeah.
Okay. If we don't know, how can we know? I mean, is there an alternative gauge by which we have a sense?
Well, we do know, right? It may not be our performance that we necessarily we're not aware going into it like, oh, my performance is going to suffer here. We don't have that view typically, but we know what it feels like to be distressed. We know it feels too much.
So like after the fact, we know.
No, even as you're in it.
Okay.
Even as you're in it, you're feeling, oh my gosh, this is too much. And so what we can know from our objective data is if you take people over a protracted period of high demand, the academic semester, for an athlete, it could be competition season or even pre-season training. For a service member, it could be pre-deployment training or deployment itself. These are periods of time where you know it's going to be demanding and the demands are not going to let up for some multiple weeks. If we test people's attention with the same kind of tasks we were talking about earlier, And then we come back 4 to 6 to 8 weeks later and give them the same battery of tasks. If that period intervening between those two time points was very demanding, we will see a significant decline in performance. And usually we see people reporting that their mood is worse and their self-reported distress is greater. So that's something to keep in mind, is that, it's not just that you feel icky and maybe burnt out from a psychological standpoint, but your actual effectiveness is going to be impacted. So I wanted to figure out a way to train people so that they could be almost mentally armored against stress. And that proved to be a really tricky thing to track down, mainly because of what you were saying earlier. There are so many solutions offered right now, like play brain training games or use this device to zap your brain with a small amount of electrical current, or
I have a Muse EEG in my hands.
Exactly. So, and I'm not going to say anything about Muse in particular or any particular technology, but I'll tell you that in our hands, in my laboratory, when people were experiencing high demand circumstances, not a lot was helpful to protecting attention from declining.
Not a lot. Okay.
Not a lot. In fact, I would say probably nothing. It reliably showed protective effects, except for one thing.
Oh, you got my attention. What is it? What do we do?
It was a little bit of a surprise to me, because I would say I was very skeptical of this solution, just for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about. But the one thing that tended to reliably, and now after about 15 years of research in my own lab and many other labs has been shown over and over again, was mindfulness meditation training. So when people engage in mindfulness meditation training for as little as 12 to 15 minutes a day, during these high stress intervals, we see that those tasks don't decline. People don't decline their performance on those tasks. They actually stay stable over time. And sometimes, if they do enough practice, even if the circumstances are likely to deplete the average person, they can actually improve. So not only stabilize, but potentially optimize attention when everything about the circumstances suggests there would be compromise to attention.
You say as little as 12 to 15 minutes. I'm curious. In some ways, I hear that's sort of like the minimum effective dose. Is there like a noticeable point of diminishing returns? Like if 12 to 15 minutes is good, is 120 to 150 minutes 10 times as good? Or how does it break down?
Yeah, I think that this is where we're just at the beginning of the science. And my interest in the research program that I'm engaged in was really to ask that first level question. These are time pressured people. We're trying to get them in the busiest, most stressful periods of their lives. What do they absolutely need to try to do to benefit themselves? And it's not one shot, 12 minutes or 15 minutes. It's over the course of multiple weeks daily. So it's like, from the physical training point of view, would walking around the block at a leisurely pace be enough to actually improve my cardiovascular health? Or do I need to run or jog or walk briskly at some level for a certain amount of time? And the answer tends to be around, maybe 20 to 30 minutes a day of brisk walking or jogging can be more beneficial than a leisurely walk. So I wanted to know that. I wanted to know what the kind of minimum dose was. And the way we were able to find this out was not by prescribing people various amounts of training to do and then seeing maybe a pharmacologic study where you give people different sized pills and say, okay, this pill is the one that worked. Humans, especially complex human behavior, doesn't work that way. So what we ended up doing is we went to the literature and said, okay, what is typically done? Because mindfulness training, even though I was one of the first labs to bring it into contexts like the military or elite sports, mindfulness training had been around not only for millennia from the wisdom traditions, but even for several decades prior to our work beginning in the military in the medical setting. And it was through a program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, which is developed by a wonderful colleague of mine, Jon Kabat-Zinn, offered in medical clinics over 750 or more now around the world, usually offered for people that are suffering from intractable physical conditions that nobody else can help them. So chronic pain, for example, people come into the clinic, they take a course for about 8 weeks, they practice 45 minutes a day, and there are benefits. There are benefits to their body, to their mind, to their relationships, and now even brain imaging studies suggest that those are benefits. But for the kind of groups that I was working with, 45 minutes a day was a non-starter. Nobody was going to do that. So in our initial studies, when, for example, working with pre-deployment Marines, we asked them to do 30 minutes a day during pre-deployment, like I said. Nobody did 30 minutes a day. So we decided to take a data emergent approach, because just telling them what to do didn't mean that they would do it. And instead we said, okay, what is the amount of time that the people that tend to benefit, what is the amount of time that they're doing? And it ended up that it was about 12 minutes or more that they were doing. And those that did less than 12 minutes really weren't benefiting. In fact, they looked no different than the people that didn't get the training at all. So then in the subsequent studies, we said, okay, if 12 minutes is some kind of sweet spot, let's only tell them to do it for 12 minutes. Let's prescribe them. Let's record guided practices that are 12 minutes long. And first of all, let's see if they do it more often. And they did. And now let's see what the benefits are. And what we found was that it was not just doing the 12-minute practices, which, like I said, people were much more willing to do than 30-minute practices, but it was doing them about 5 days a week where we started seeing benefits.
I'd love to hear, we talk about the benefits. What does that mean in terms of quantitativeness? So we talked about attention decrements. It's like it's worse. Attention being worse when you don't do it. Could you maybe just contextualize or share some numbers? Is like, am I going to be able to focus a smidgen better, like 3% better, if I do my 12 to 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week? Or kind of what's the, roughly speaking, size of the prize for the average professional?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking between something like that, between 5 and 10% better.
And what is the numerator denominator we're measuring with better?
Well, let's just take one very specific task, the sustained attention response task. Like I said, you're going to press a button every time you see a digit. When you see a 3, you withhold. People typically press to the 3 50% of the time, even though they're not supposed to. And this is usually because they are mentally time traveling away. They're hijacked away. They're kind of go on autopilot and they just press. The 3 appears, they press, and then they might have it. Oh, shoot. They realize they've made a mistake. Too late. You already pressed. So that is the baseline. Under high stress, that number goes up. People press to the 3 even more often. And with mindfulness training, we see that they can benefit with about 10% improvement from their baseline. And so what does that mean, right? And you might say, well, that's okay, great. So I don't press to the 3. Why do I care? Like, why does that matter? What we think it represents is really this ability to be more present centered because you're noting what's happening moment by moment. You're not defaulting to autopilot. It also translates into really a correspondence with actual activities. So for example, in the context of soldiers, if you're doing a shoot, no shoot drill, so that you know that you are to shoot to the bad guys and withhold from the innocent civilians. And if you're making that level of mistakes, a 10% improvement is giant. It actually means life or death benefits for people. And those are numbers that really matter and are actionable for people to not make grave errors that could cost them for their entire lives. So, I mean, I'll just tell you that we're just at the beginning of now trying to translate laboratory-based metrics into what we call operationally relevant metrics. How does it translate into real life? But we're starting to be able to ask those questions to see in the kinds of tasks that people do. So, for example, medical errors. What is the actionable benefit for mindfulness training on the rate of medical errors? And again, this is now data that's just starting to be gathered, so I can't give you precise numbers. We're really on the edge of this knowledge right now, but we're asking the right questions to say, okay, attention may be protected and benefited. How does it matter and how does it show up in people's lives? But even before we go to the objective, what we notice people saying is that they're more there. They're not wandering away. The quality of their own relationships is improved. Their leadership capacity is improved. Their ability to do their jobs and feel engaged in their jobs is improved. So that's just painting the picture of where we are at the science in the moment.
And that's interesting. I can't help but run some numbers in terms of an 8-hour workday, 5 to 10% more attentive minutes. That's very rough and crude. I mean, that is significant to the tune of that 24 to 48 extra minutes, which is a lot more than 12 to 15 in terms of a profitable endeavor for us.
Yeah. And those are just estimates right now. I think that it's probably a lot even more than that if you think about the nature of what kinds of processes improve. So it's not just being able to pay attention, which is just so important, but mood improves, work enjoyment and engagement improve. Presenteeism is going down. There's a whole literature on mindfulness in the workplace that is now revealing the benefits for organizations to offer this in the workplace context. And then, of course, moving forward, it may actually impact work culture so that, it's very normal to begin a meeting with, as my colleagues at the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute say, a moment to arrive. It's like every meeting, people are probably wandering way more than 50% of the time. But what if we make it part of the culture that we're actually here? What if you can cut meeting times down because you don't have to repeat yourselves, or there's not conflicting and ambiguous information being thrown around because more people are really there. They're not on their phone and they're not off in their own mental time travel. I'd love to say a little bit about what attention is, because we've also kind of been using that word in a blanket way. I like to break it down as sort of, there's this giant concept of attention, which is really, broadly speaking, the ability to prioritize some information over other information. And we evolved this ability to solve a big problem that the brain had, which is that there's just way more out there in the world and even generated within our mind than we can fully process in any moment. So this notion and process of prioritization allows us to have more fine-tuned and granular information accessible to us while everything else sort of fades into the background. So something is prominent and other things are not. And when we think about the topic of attention and the way it's been studied, we're learning that there's probably three main ways that we pay attention. In fact, three main brain systems that support these different ways of paying attention. So the first way is really just probably the way we've been using it kind of without even talking about it explicitly, focus. The notion that there's content, and like just right now, I'm looking at your face. I'm not looking at the curtains behind you or whatever, the door behind you, whatever I see, I'm able to focus in on the granular details, seeing the expression on your face, etc. Everything else kind of fades into the background. So the metaphor for this that I like to use is like a flashlight. If I were in a darkened room, wherever I direct that flashlight, I'm going to get crisp, clear, privileged information relative to everything that's darkened around it. Attention really does the same thing in this kind of flashlight metaphor, something called the orienting system of attention. And by the way, this is that same system that we talked about that ends up being a problem with social media and the pull on our attention. Because just like a flashlight, we can direct orienting willfully. We can decide where we want to point our attention. We can move it around. We can direct it toward the external environment or the internal environment. Like if I said, Pete, what is the sensation right now of the bottoms of your feet? Probably before I said that, you had no idea. You weren't thinking about it. But now you can check in and give me an answer.
I'm on a standing mat. It's got a cushiony vibe to it.
There you go. See? So squishy and pleasant, probably. But that same flashlight can get yanked. And the kinds of things that yank it have those features of salient, self-related, threatening, novel, like all these kinds of things that are programmed into us. But that's still just one system of attention, this kind of flashlight or orienting system. Another way we can pay attention is not privileging content, but privileging time. So what's happening right now? That's something that we call the alerting system. And if you want to think about when we use this, like driving down the road or walking down the road, you see a flashing yellow traffic light or something near a construction sign, something that's blinking and alarming. You're at the ready. You're broad, receptive, alert. But you don't want to be focused in on anything because you have no idea what could be coming. It could be weird equipment joining into the road or children or traffic patterns are weird. Something's odd, and pay attention to what's happening right now. So we can privilege content like with the flashlight or privilege time with the alerting system. And then the third way in which we can privilege information with attention is something called executive control, which we've definitely already talked about as it relates to sort of working memory. We're privileging information processing based on our goals. So what is my goal right now? And is my action and what I'm paying attention to and doing, meaning the way I'm directing the other two systems, is it aligned to ensure that the actions and the goals are going to be aligned the whole way? Or am I off goal? Or am I not even sure what the goal is? These are ways in which we pay attention that can be so powerful, but quite different. Going back to your question regarding mindfulness, one of the reasons I think it ended up being super useful is that mindfulness training, which is essentially, I would describe as paying attention to our present moment experience without elaboration or reactivity, without having a story about it. Attention is central to mindfulness. And when you think about mindfulness practices, they actually engage and exercise all three of these systems of attention over and over again. in a generalizable manner.
And so when we do a mindfulness meditation training, you mentioned paying attention to the present, what's up right now, presently, without sort of elaborating or creating stories. So that's kind of could incorporate a whole bundle of different activities. So what are some of your faves?
Yeah. So, and this is where, again, we borrow from the existing literature. We didn't invent all these things and the existing traditions, frankly. But one very, very common one is mindfulness of the breath, where the intention, I actually don't call it mindfulness of the breath the way that I teach it, because I know the vulnerabilities when we say that. I call it the find your flashlight practice. And really it's because that flashlight is such a handy way to think about how we can willfully direct our attention. But what we have to get insight into is oftentimes we don't know where our attention is. We have no clue. So I'm just going to give you a very kind of quick view of this. So it is essentially the same thing as other people might describe as mindfulness of the breath or focused attention. There's so many different terms for it. But essentially what you do is sit in a comfortable, quiet spot, dedicate a period of time where you're going to do this practice. And the first step is essentially to notice that you're breathing. And, obviously we've been breathing this entire time, but we haven't probably been paying attention to our breath. But we're checking into the fact that we're breathing. And then we're going to notice what is most vivid in the breathscape of our present moment experience. And that's actually why I think the breath is so handy. You can't save up your breath. I mean, I guess you could hold your breath, but you can't really save it up. It's happening. It's transpiring in the moment. And literally it is about a respiratory rhythm. So we notice what is most vivid tied to the breath. And that's where we say, for this period of time, my task, my goal, executive control says my goal is pay attention to breath-related sensation. Take that flashlight, point it toward the prominent breath-related sensation and hold it there. That's the agenda for this. Let's say you start out by just doing 1 minute of this practice. Then the second part of the instruction, the first part is just focus on breath-related sensation, engage that flashlight. The second part of the instruction is notice if your mind wanders away. So it's like you're checking in and monitoring, where is this flashlight? Is it at the breath-related sensation? All of a sudden you're like thinking of the next vacation you're going to take, or some worry you had, or a troubling conversation, or maybe there's an itch on your face, or whatever it is. Look at that. Flashlight's not at the breath-related sensation. And in that moment, the third part of the instruction, redirect attention back to breath-related sensations. So it's literally like my military colleagues, I love the way they put it. It's like you're giving me a mental push-up. Focus, notice, redirect. Or in other words, engage the flashlight, engage alerting and monitoring, and then executive control to know what the goal is and make sure I'm getting back on track. So that's why I think that it can be so handy to understand how attention works, because then we understand why we're doing it. It's not sort of some nebulous concept. It's actually a workout for our mind in this particular way.